Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to be creating a beach card with 3 different techniques. I'm going to be using the Flower Child stamp set along with the See You Soon stamp set to create a slimline card. Now, one of the traditional sizes for a slimline card is 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I wasn't sure if it was too slim, so I have a piece of watercolor cardstock here that is 4 inches by 8.5 inches. I do end up trimming it down to 3.5 by 8.5 once I'm done, but it's always nicer to have a little bit larger surface when you start and trim it down afterwards rather than running out of space. The 3 techniques I'm going to be using on this card is watercolor. I will be masking my stamped images to create a scene between the 2 different stamp sets. And I'm also going to be doing a little bit of mirror stamping. And by doing that mirror stamping, I'll be able to create a little bit of a reflection in the water. So I'm putting my Flower Child stamp towards the top. She is quite large. I want to see a little bit of the sky above her, but I also want to give a decent amount of space for the water below her. So I'm going to use a little bit of embossing powder tool on my watercolor cardstock. When you use watercolor cardstock, there's one side that's textured, one side that's flat. When I'm doing stamping, I typically use the flat side so that we have a better chance of getting a good stamping. I'm using some embossing ink because I want to heat emboss my images. I always prefer to heat emboss my images when I am watercoloring. Firstly, because I like the look of it. It gives it a little bit of extra texture. It also makes that watercolor a little bit easier because those lines have ridges to them. So the watercolor tends to stay where I want it to go. I'm heat embossing this with some Walnut stain distress clay. I thought it would be a little less harsh and a little bit more natural and organic than using black embossing powder. So I stamped it, I poured that embossing powder on there, and I'm using a soft brush to brush off some of the bottom of her jeans as well as her feet. I want to create a reflection in the water and I want it to look like she is wading in the water. I don't want the image of her jeans and feet under the water to be embossed. I want to do just some plain BetterPress or archival ink for that. So something that is permanent, that is not going to wash away when I do watercolor over top of it. I still want to see that, but I don't want it heat embossed. So by using a brush on there, I can brush off that embossing powder and I can go and stamp this again just with some BetterPress ink on the bottom of the stamp set to create the lines there, but they will be underneath the water. So I'm using this Woodlands BetterPress ink set. These are archival inks, but they are made for the BetterPress system, but you can just stamp with them as well. Now, the one thing to know is these inks will stamp your stamp. So as I'm working, you'll see that my stamp gets a little bit stained. As long as it's cleaned off properly, it's totally fine. Staining doesn't affect the stamping ability of a stamp, but because it is a permanent ink, you also want to use some ultra clean or some permanent ink cleaner to clean that stamp set. So I'm using a little bit of masking magic. I want to be able to create the beach grass behind her. And by using some masking magic, I can create a mask to put on top of her. So when I go to stamp that behind there, it's not going to go right on top of her. It's going to look like it's behind her. So I just use that BetterPress ink to stamp it on the masking sheets. Now I only really need this up to her chin. I don't need her whole head cut out. So you can see as I'm going and doing her head, I'm just going to be kind of going loosely around her because the grass is going to be just behind her body. I don't need to be super clear or super detailed with going around her head because we don't need to stamp anything near there. And by putting that stamp right over top, I just confirmed that I don't need to have that fussy cut on top of there. I'm using some detailed scissors in order to cut that out. We want to go right alongside those lines. Masking magic sheets are like Post-it note sheets with adhesive over the whole thing. They are adhesive all over the back, but it's an adhesive that peels right up really easily, so we're not going to rip any paper. It's just covering our stamped and embossed image and protecting that from stamping over top of it. So once we have that done, I can put this right over top of our stamped and embossed image. Now, because it's embossed, it's not going to stick nearly as well as it would if she were stamped flat on here, but it's going to be enough to create the look that I'm going for. So I'm matching up the lines right along her overalls as well as her chin, making sure that that all matches up. Then I'm going to be using the grass stamp from the See You Soon stamp set. I'm going to be stamping this with embossing ink and then heat embossing it with some peeled paint distress glaze. I want those grasses to be green. If I were to stamp it in a different color and then watercolor, that is possible, but I like the texture of the embossing as well as the fact that a lot of this stamp set is blades of grass, so it works perfectly to stamp it in or to emboss it in that peeled paint distress glaze and then add some watercolor for the detail to it. So once I have stamped it with that VersaMark ink, and you can see that because my mask wasn't sticking as well as it would if it were a flat image, it did lift up when I stamped it with that VersaMark ink because the VersaMark ink is fairly sticky, but I got enough of the thing resisted as, or the image resisted as possible. When I went to add that distress glaze onto the stamped image, you could see that some of it went on the front of her overalls. Easy enough to just use a brush and brush that off. Once I have it brushed off and I don't have any embossing glaze where I don't want it to go, I can use my heat tool and I can emboss that grass right on there. So I have one more stamp here that I want to heat emboss, and that is the water. So this is typically for using the See You Soon stamp set. This would be the water with the horizon line. I'm going to be using it as the water edge with the like ripply waves on there. And I'm going to heat emboss this with white embossing powder because it works perfectly for those little waves. You could also use more of a watercolor if you wanted to have those ripples of the waves in, say, a blue. That would work as well. I typically like to do them in white, kind of like the foam, kind of like just the edges of the water. Again, just like my greens, if I have any white where I don't want it to go, I'm using that soft brush to brush it away before I heat emboss it. When you heat emboss it, it's melting that embossing powder and it is going to stay where you melt it. So if you see any embossing powder where you don't want it before time, definitely brush it off and then melt your powder. Now I am going to do the reflective stamping on where the water is, where the ocean is. I don't necessarily want a full image. I'm using the BetterPress inks and I'm working on watercolor cardstock here. We're not going to get a complete image here because the BetterPress inks dry fairly quickly on the acetate, which is what I'm using here. If I were using an ink that was dye-based that wasn't going to dry on the acetate, it would leave more ink on the surface that I want the reflection in. However, because I am watercoloring over this, if I use dye-based ink, that is going to rehydrate that dye ink and it is going to basically erase it when I do my watercoloring. So I want to use a permanent ink for this, and these are just BetterPress pads. They're archival ink. StazOn would work for this as well, but again, they all dry fairly quickly on non-porous surfaces, so you have to work really, really quickly. Because it's a reflection in the water, I don't necessarily need a complete reflection, perfect reflection. Having just the suggestion of it on the water is going to be totally fine. And you'll see by the time I get finished with it what I mean by that. When you see a reflection on the water, I mean, sometimes you can get like a fair amount of detail, but especially if it's a reflection of, say, grasses and nature, it's kind of hazy, it's a little bit ripply, it's not going to be perfect and complete anyway. So I wasn't looking for that. I was just looking for the suggestion of the reflection there. I'm starting with the background sky and I'm using some Tumbled Glass Distress refills for these. I have them all in an alcohol ink palette. Each one of these has a little well to it. Distress re-inkers are intended for refilling distress pads, and I always love having another way to use my tools. So by using them for watercolor, it works perfectly. The one thing to note though is this has to be stored horizontally. You cannot store it vertically. These inks will not dry in the palette. They'll always stay wet. I've had these for years and I've never had an ink dry in here. For my grasses, I'm using some peeled paint re-inker. Now I'm using these re-inkers. You can use whatever watercolors you prefer. Again, I just like knowing that I have a tool here that can do more than one job. You could also use, say, distress crayons or watercolor pencils. That absolutely works as well. If you happen to not have any of those things, but you have some dye-based ink pads or dye-based markers, you could also use those. You could scribble those or press those onto a non-porous surface and use that as a watercolor palette. For my posts there, as well as my trail, I'm using some Vintage Photo Distress refill. I'm also using the same color for her hair, making sure that we have darker areas toward the base of the bun where the bun attaches to her hair, or her head, as well as right behind her little headband that she's wearing. For the path, I made the path a little bit darker towards the distance and then lighter towards the waterline. And then for those posts that are in the grass area, I watercolored them first, and then I use my brush to remove some of the excess color just to give them a little bit of a highlight. Now the brush that I'm using has water in the handle. So to my right, I have a piece of paper towel that I use to squeeze the brush to let the water flow through those bristles and clean the bristles out. Then I can also use it if I happen to have too much water or too much color on my brush. I can use that paper towel, just tap the brush right on there, and I can take the excess color or the excess water out of there. So it's really easy to use. I tend to be a bit of a klutz, so by having a brush that has the water in the handle, it eliminates having a glass of water that I will likely spill over or drink from, because that's the hot mess that I am. For the brown, for the beach sand, I am going a little bit into the water. Then I'm going to take that tumbled glass and I'm going to start working on the water, and I'm going to blend it a little bit into the brown. Right at the edge of the water, that water is so transparent and clear that you see more sand. You don't really see any color from the water. So having those two blend together is what looks a little bit more realistic. When I do the water, I do some areas that are a little bit darker, some areas that are a little bit lighter. And towards the base of my card, it's going to be a little bit darker. It's going to be a little bit lighter as it gets closer to the edge of the water, where that water is just a little bit narrower. Now, this is the same color that I chose to use for the sky. You could also use other color tones if you wanted them to be different, but I like the fact that they're fairly similar to each other, as well as the fact that I wanted to do her overalls with some Stormy Sky Distress ink, which is kind of a denim color to it. So I wanted to make sure that there was definitely a difference between the color of her overalls and the color of the water. I'm also going to make the overalls have a little bit darker towards the edges and a little bit darker right where they would meet the water. They'd be sucking up some water and end up being a little bit darker. So I want that to be darker there as well. I'm going to use that same color on the base part of her headband, just so we have a little bit of color coordination between those two. You could even get really creative with the color of her overalls as well if you wanted to add a pop of color there too. I'm choosing to add that pop of color for the flowers on her headband as well as the flowers in the grass. So I'm choosing to leave that there, but I think it would be really fun to do that pop of color on her as well. I did another video with this flower child where I did some paper piecing that I absolutely love the look of. So I'm going to link that at the end of this video if you'd like another idea of something to do with her. With that, I was using some printed papers and I really couldn't choose which combination I wanted to do, so I ended up creating 2 cards. She is absolutely adorable. I just love the look of her and perfect for so many different things, especially something like this where you're creating a little bit of a beach scene. This is part of an Instagram hop that is taking place on the day that this goes live, where the theme is adventure awaits. And in my opinion, my type of adventure is heading to the beach, checking out the seashells, the sights, the smells, this noise or the sounds. So this is my type of adventure. I love anywhere like waterside, if you will. So that's where I chose to go with the theme of adventure awaits. And I just love the final result of the 2 of the stamps together. So for the flowers in the grass as well as on her little headband, I'm using some picked raspberry distress ink. This is a nice bright pink. I'm starting by being a little bit, I'm diluting that color a little bit, making it a little bit lighter. Then I can go in with a darker shade of the color and I can dot it towards the center of the flower, the base of the petals, so that we have a little bit of color variation. And because those flowers are still wet, that color is going to instantly bleed into each other and we're going to get a little bit of highlights as well as shading on those flowers. I opted to just use some black on the centers of the flowers, but you could also use, say, a pop of yellow if you wanted. If you wanted to do a pop of yellow or something that is not, that the pink wouldn't, or that wouldn't get covered up by the pink, I would make sure when you're watercoloring the base to not watercolor right over top of the flower centers. I typically like flowers like this having darker centers to them, and that's why I chose to just go over the entire thing. But you certainly could change up those colors if you wanted. I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to the water. So I'm using some Opal Blush Interference ink, just smushing that pad right over top of our watercolored water there. And I'm not doing it over the entire thing. I'm just doing it towards the edges. So the shore, the edges of the cardstock, the base. Opal Blush Interference ink. It is blue ink, but it has a pink interference to it. So it's going to have a little bit of shimmer, or add a little bit of shimmer to that water. Another option here would be to mask the top of the card and then say use a shimmer spray on there. Another option would be to use something like Perfect Pearls or something that you can create your own shimmery watercolor and add that little sparkle there. Now, because our base is still a tiny little bit damp, I'm going in with some peeled paint distress ink as well as that weathered wood that was used for her overalls, and just kind of doing little streaks to create or to enhance that look of the reflection there. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. It's a reflection in water. It's not going to be absolutely pristine and perfect, but I do want to give the suggestion of that reflection. Once we have our image nice and dry, we can add some glossy accents to her eyes. This is just going to give her eyes some glossy dome dimension, and especially because she's got such big, beautiful eyes there, I thought it would be a really nice way to add that extra little bit of texture as well as that extra little bit of shine to it. For the centers of the flowers, both on the grass as well as the headband, I'm using a little bit of Stickles. We're still going to be able to see the color underneath there, but it's just going to add a little bit of sparkle as well as texture to that image. And I'm also using that Stickles against the white embossing on the edges of the water to add that extra little bit of sparkle there as well. While we're waiting for the glossy accents and the Stickles to dry, I'm going to create a sentiment for my card. So I chose one of the sentiments in the Flower Child stamp set. I want to heat emboss it on some vellum. This way I can put this strip right over top of our image, and that sentiment is still going to stick out nicely. It's going to just mute the colors that are right below it a little bit because of that vellum. I'm going to heat emboss it with white embossing powder just to make sure that it's nice and prominent right on top of that water. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that vellum piece, stamped it with some embossing ink, and then poured on some white embossing powder, and then I'll use my heat tool to melt that embossing powder. Now, one of the things that a lot of people struggle with when it comes to vellum is adhesive, gluing it to your card. The way that I use vellum is I use score tape. It comes in many different widths. This one happens to be 35 millimeters. It comes as narrow as 1/8 of an inch. You can even get it as wide as 12 inches wide. For this particular one, I'm using the one that is 35 millimeters. I'm putting it over the entire back. It is a transparent adhesive. So once I trim this strip down and I take that backing off, we're not going to be able to see that there's adhesive on it at all because it's over that entire surface. So we're not going to be able to see the edges of adhesive, and it solves that problem completely. It makes it into a vellum sticker. Now, while waiting for the Stickles and the glossy accents to dry, I decided I can easily trim off a little bit from each side and make my slimline card 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I don't have to take anything off the top and the bottom, but I am going to take a little bit off of each side to make sure that we don't lose a whole lot from that background. Now, the one thing that I didn't mention is I did use some black StazOn, and I stamped the seagulls from the See You Soon stamp set in the background. I did this before I did the watercoloring, but I realized now that I forgot to mention it. To add a little bit of frame to this image without trimming it even more, I'm just rubbing my embossing pad, my VersaMark pad, along the edge of the cardstock, dipping it into some walnut stain distress glaze. If you happen to get that distress glaze a little bit too wide, you can use your fingers to remove any excess from it. So it's a nice organic way to frame it. It's going to be completely uneven all the way along, so you'll have some areas that are a little bit thicker, some areas that are thinner, but I think it totally suits the look of the stamp set and the look of the image. And I just love doing this sometimes for an interesting way to add that little bit of frame. Another option would be to use an ink pad, do a little bit of ink blending around the edges, but I didn't want to change the colors of our image too much. So this is a great way to frame it, to keep with the vibe of the whole thing, and you also get the bonus of having that distress glaze be nice and glossy there, so it adds that extra little bit of texture. With that done, we can add our sentiment to the front there, and you can see that I purposely left my sentiment a little bit longer. That way I could have a little bit of room to move it back and forth to make sure that it was the right size. Then I just used some detail scissors to trim that down, and we're ready to add that to our slimline card base. That card base is 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I cut a piece of white cardstock 7 inches by 8.5 inches and just scored it at the 3.5 mark. And this way we have a unique card shape, but we get a really nice scene with it because we have that extra length to that card to add the reflection and that little bit more, that little bit of extra water to it. So I don't do slimline cards very often, but having a different size to work with definitely gives you a creative opportunity to get a little bit outside of your comfort zone. You'll find everything that I've used to create this card listed and linked down in the description box below. And I hope this little Stamping Beach adventure has inspired you to look at your stamp sets and which ones you can combine together to create different scenes or completely different looks than what the original stamp sets were intended. It's definitely a fun way to use your stamps by combining them and blending them and mixing them, masking them, creating mirror images. It's just a fun way to create. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.